The purpose of this video is to explain the requirements and guidelines for the response paper assignments that you will complete in this class. Here I will cover the purpose of the assignment, how many papers you must complete, how you will submit your papers, the assignment due dates, the structure and format of the papers, as well as the prompts that you will respond to when you write your paper. Now, one important note before we begin. This video was made with documents for a section of this class that was taught in the fall of 2022. This means that if you are not taking this class in the fall of 2022, then some of the specific information on those documents, such as the precise number of paper opportunities and the due dates for those papers, may not apply to you. However, the correct information that applies to your specific section of the class can be found on the syllabus for your section of the course, as well as on the response paper guidelines document that is posted to Moodle. The response paper guidelines document can be found in the course information and resources area of Moodle. This document describes the points I will discuss in this video and contains the essay prompts for each response paper assignment. I want to begin by saying a few things about the purpose of this assignment. Stated simply, the purpose of the response paper assignment is to provide students an opportunity to practice the skills needed to engage in close reading of a philosophical text, explain a philosophical argument, and then criticize that philosophical argument. To that end, in these papers you will first be required to provide an explanation of the reasoning the author makes in the reading, and then you will be required to criticize that reasoning or offer some reasons why the author's argument is faulty, invalid, or unsound. Now, one question you may have at this point is the following. Why am I required to criticize the argument that I am writing about? What if I agree with that argument? This is a good question. In short, the reason for this is not because I require you to think any particular way about the arguments we cover in this class. You might find good reason to accept certain arguments and reject others. And my purpose here is not to make you or force you to believe any particular thing about the claims made in the readings. Rather, the reason I have this requirement is simply because a student is more likely to think critically about the argument if they are required to criticize it. However, this question really deserves a more substantial response than I've given here, and really a more substantial response than I can actually give in this video. So for further explanation of this point, please see the supplemental lecture entitled, "What If I Agree?" And you can find a link to this video in the description section of this lecture below. What you are currently looking at is the first page of the response paper guidelines document. Recall that this document can be found in the course resources and information area of Moodle. To begin, we will discuss how many papers you are required to complete. There are 6 opportunities to submit a response paper throughout the course of the semester. However, you are only required to submit papers for 4 of these opportunities. Which 4 of these papers you complete is up to you, but with the following 2 qualifications. First, you must complete at least 2 of the first 3 response papers. This is because a primary objective of this assignment is to allow you to improve your work on the papers as the semester progresses, and that will not be possible if you wait until the very end of the semester to turn in all of your response papers. So this requirement ensures that half of the papers you write will come in the first half of the course. The second qualification is that you cannot submit any more than 4 papers total. For instance, you cannot complete 5 papers so that a higher grade on the 5th paper will replace a lower grade on an earlier paper. However, you should keep in mind that a lower grade on an earlier paper is not going to ruin your grade in the class for the whole semester. My expectation, again, is that there will be improvement over the course of the class, and when I make final grade adjustments at the end of the semester, one thing I take into account is improvement on this assignment. Those students who displayed consistent improvement on these papers may be eligible to have a borderline grade bumped up to the next letter category. Now, let's turn to the due dates for the response papers. Each response paper has its own due date, and a paper will not be accepted once its due date has passed. There are 2 places in which you can find the due date for each response paper assignment. The first place that you can see the due date for the response papers is on the course schedule of the syllabus. For instance, in this case we see from the course schedule that response paper 1 is due during week 2 of the class by the end of the day on Sunday of that week. To take another example, if we move to week 3 of the course schedule, we can see that response paper 2 is due by the end of the day on Sunday of week 3. Now, in the vast majority of cases, the response papers will always be due by the end of the day on Sunday. There could be some rare exceptions in some cases, so remember to always consult the actual course syllabus and the weekly instruction letters for the correct due dates for all assignments. You can also find the due dates for each response paper assignment on the response paper guidelines document itself. Currently, you're looking at section 5 of the table of contents of that document, where there is a separate area containing information for each response paper assignment. Information for response paper 1 can be found on page 9, information for response paper 2 on page 10, and etc. Now suppose I wanted to find out further information about response paper 1. In that case, I would simply click on the line for response paper 1 in the table of contents. We see here that response paper 1 is due at the end of the day on Sunday of week 2. In addition, you will also notice that this area of the document includes the essay prompts for response paper 1. The prompt is what will tell you specifically what you are supposed to write about and will provide you with guidance for explaining and critiquing the reading. And I will cover the response paper prompts in greater detail later in this video. Finally, let's take a look at how you will submit your response paper assignments. Suppose you wanted to turn in a response paper that was due in week 2. In that case, you would visit the week 2 area of Moodle and scroll down to the bottom of the page. Here you can see the submission area for response paper 1. You can submit by clicking on the link for this assignment and then uploading your document. You will also notice that the submission area includes the due date for the assignment as well as a description of the essay prompts for that response paper. Now, let's discuss the format of your response paper. The word requirement for this paper is that it must be at least 600 words, and this does not include title, section headings, bibliography, your name, etc. That means 600 words of actual written text, and this 600 words is merely the minimum requirement. You are welcome to go over 600 words, and I will not penalize you merely for exceeding any upper limit of words. There are some additional length requirements for the paper as well, and in order to explain these, I need to say something about how your paper needs to be organized. Your paper needs to be divided into 3 sections, and those sections need to be labeled as you see on the screen. First, there is the explanation section. Second, there is the analysis section. And third, we have the bibliography section. The explanation section and analysis sections each also have their own word requirement. Each of those sections individually must be at least 200 words. The reason for this requirement is to ensure that your paper is balanced. The purpose of your explanation section is to explain the argument you are writing about, and the purpose of the analysis section will be to criticize that argument. And both tasks are important. So you would not want to spend 590 words, for example, explaining the argument and then only have one sentence criticizing it. Again, these requirements are just minimums. You are welcome to go past 200 words on either or both sections. And in fact, you would actually have to have more than 200 words in at least one of these sections in order to meet the overall word requirement of 600 words. For purposes of illustration, here is an example of what I would do to begin this assignment. Imagine I was writing a response paper on an essay prompt having to do with Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. If I were writing such a paper, the first thing that I would do is put the basic structure of the paper in place. That means immediately placing section headings for the explanation section, analysis section, and the bibliography section. Having these section headings in your paper is part of the basic requirements for this assignment. This is because doing so both will organize your paper more effectively, as well as help me when I grade by indicating precisely where to find your explanation and your criticism of the argument you are writing about. I have also included my name at the top of the paper, as well as entitled this paper, Aristotle's Function Argument. Does human life have a purpose? The title indicates that the paper will cover Aristotle's famous function argument, and it also previews the sort of question that I will be asking about it. So, I would recommend that you begin by writing these exact section headings that you will then fill in with the content that you wish to convey to the reader in your paper. Next, you will need to select an essay prompt. Now suppose you were going to write Response Paper 1. The description for this assignment, found in the Response Paper Guidelines document, tells us to write about one and only one of the essay prompts listed. In this case, there are 3 different essay prompts to choose from. Suppose you decide to write about essay prompt 2. How does this essay prompt help you write the paper effectively? Well, let's examine each component of the prompt. The essay prompt begins by identifying some specific portion of the text for you to focus on. This prompt identifies an argument found in Book 1, Chapter 7 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that begins on page 11 and ends on page 12. So your primary focus should be on this portion of the text. Now, this does not mean that the rest of the reading is irrelevant. In fact, it is likely that the rest of the reading provides necessary context for understanding the argument. However, you want to make sure your paper focuses on the portion of the text specified in the prompt. In other words, when I grade your paper, I will primarily be looking for strong evidence that you understand the specific argument the prompt identifies. While the prompts do allow some flexibility in how you approach the assignment, and of course different students may approach the assignment differently, you will still want to make sure that you are responding to the specific argument referenced in the prompt. The main purpose of the essay prompt is to help you narrow your attention upon one portion of the reading so that you do not get overwhelmed by taking on too much material. This will allow you to go into more detail in your analysis, make your writing more focused, and make the assignment overall much more manageable. Following this, the prompt tells you to explain and criticize this argument. This is a reference to the two major sections of the paper that we will discuss in more detail later. In the explanation section of the paper, you will explain the argument, and in the analysis section of the paper, you will criticize the argument. The prompt then ends with a series of questions. In this case, the questions it asks are, is it true that everything has a characteristic activity or purpose? Where might such purposes come from? Is Aristotle correct that a thing only flourishes or does well if it fulfills its purpose? And etc. Now I should clarify the purpose of these questions in the prompt. While you may very well end up addressing all these questions in the course of writing your paper, doing so is not required. These questions are just there to help you begin to think about the most important claims of the argument and to give you some direction and guidance. In this way, the response paper prompts are significantly different from the final exam essay prompts. As we'll discuss in a later video, the exam essay prompts require you to answer every point contained in the prompt. For the response paper prompts, however, the questions it contains are again simply there to help you begin thinking about the topic. Now that we understand the structure of the paper, we will take some time to address each section of the paper, beginning with the bibliography. Your bibliography should list each source that you used in your paper. And the first question you probably have is, are we required to use outside sources, or is there a certain number that you are required to use? The answer to this question is that the only required source is the reading that you are writing about. You are also permitted to use other sources, but doing so is not required. In addition, it is most likely that using outside sources will also not be necessary, but it is acceptable to use them, keeping in mind some restrictions that I will cover shortly. Because we do not have a textbook, and because all readings are posted online to Moodle, you might wonder how you can find out the bibliographic information for the readings. To make this easier, I have listed that information on the Response Paper Guidelines document, so you can simply go to section 3.4. Here you'll find the citation information for every reading. Then you can simply copy the information that you need. And then paste it directly into the bibliography section of your paper. If you do use outside sources, then those also need to be cited. On the Response Paper Guidelines document, I have provided some examples of how to properly cite different types of sources. Here you will find examples for journal articles, book chapters, books, etc., and you can follow these models when citing your sources. You are also required to have in-text citations within the body of your paper itself. First, I will explain the format that these citations need to take, and then I will explain when these in-text citations need to be used. For in-text citations, you need to place the author's name followed by the page number in parentheses at the end of the sentence. For example, imagine that I write the following sentence in my hypothetical paper. Aristotle argues that just as specific occupations and jobs have a function they are meant to fulfill, so the human being in general is meant to fulfill a certain function as well. Here I reference a claim that Aristotle makes on page 11 of the reading, and I indicate this by writing the author's name and page number in parentheses. It is important to notice here that I am not directly quoting Aristotle. Rather, I am paraphrasing a claim that Aristotle makes in my own words. And there are a few important points that I need to make about this. First, in this assignment, you are not permitted to use any direct quotations. That is, you are not permitted to take text directly from the reading, put quotations around it, and cite that in your paper. Now, to be clear, there is nothing wrong with doing this in general, but in this short of an assignment, I do not want you to take up too much space with someone else's words. So that means that all of your in-text citations will be a paraphrase that you have made of the text. When paraphrasing the text, you should not merely restate the author's statement with slightly different wording. Rather, I want to see that you can explain the point in your own words using your own examples in a way that shows your understanding. While explaining the philosopher's argument, it should still be clear that your own voice is coming through in the writing of the paper. But when do you need to use an in-text citation? An in-text citation should be used whenever you are attributing some claim to the author. Whenever you claim that the author argues, states, holds, or believes that something is true. If you make such a statement in your paper, then that is paraphrasing the author and it should be cited. The idea here is that if the author you are writing about holds some belief or makes some argument, then there must be some specific page where that belief or argument can be found. Consequently, you need to specify that page, and you do that with an in-text citation. Consider the previous example. Here I attribute to Aristotle the claim that the human being in general has a purpose or function that she is supposed to fulfill. This paraphrase refers to the following passage from page 11 of the text. Aristotle writes, "Well, do the carpenter and the tanner have characteristic activities and actions, and a human being none? Has nature left him without a characteristic activity to perform? Or, as there seem to be characteristic activities of the eye, the hand, the foot, and generally of each part of the body, should one assume that a human being has some characteristic activity over and above all these?" Obviously, my paraphrase in my paper is quite different from the actual words Aristotle uses. In this passage, Aristotle makes his point using suggestive or rhetorical questions. In my paraphrase, however, I distill those questions into the general principle that Aristotle is attempting to establish. In any case, the main point here is that whenever you attribute some claim to an author, you should have in mind the specific page where that claim occurs and make sure to cite it in your paper. The final topic to address in this section is plagiarism and the proper use of external sources. I should first address what plagiarism is. Plagiarism occurs when a person attempts to pass off the ideas of another person as their own, and it can be either unintentional or intentional. Unintentional plagiarism occurs when material from an author is not cited correctly or not cited at all. When this happens, it does not necessarily mean the student is intentionally trying to cheat the assignment. However, the effect can be the same since without a citation, it would be assumed that it must be the writer's idea. So, it is important to understand and follow the citation guidelines that I just explained. The more serious form of plagiarism, however, is the intentional variety. This occurs when a student has the explicit goal of taking material from another source and then presenting it as their own. This most often occurs when a student searches for information about some class reading through the internet and then copies that material directly into their paper, or perhaps does so with just minor word changes. You should know that I take plagiarism, and intentional plagiarism in particular, very seriously. This is because plagiarism undermines the integrity of the assignment and consequently also undermines the integrity of the class as a whole. For this reason, I check for it when grading, and any case of plagiarism will result in the student receiving a 0 on the assignment. Furthermore, it is important to understand that even if cited, not all kinds of external sources are appropriate for this kind of assignment. For an academic paper, you should generally only use sources that are peer-reviewed. So this means that sources like Wikipedia, internet blogs or discussion forums, or online class notes posted by other professors are all not appropriate for this assignment. This latter example is particularly important because this is one of the most common ways, along with Wikipedia, in which students end up engaging in plagiarism. This is not to say that none of these things have value. Wikipedia, for example, is a very valuable website which has made vast quantities of information available to many people. However, this source simply is not appropriate for an academic paper simply because it is not peer-reviewed. Furthermore, I would again emphasize that you do not have to use any outside sources at all. In fact, you will often be best served by simply focusing on the class reading that you are writing about. You do not want your use of external sources to take the place of you explaining the material in your own words in a way that shows your own understanding. Still, if you are looking for additional information from an outside source, then I would recommend you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The latter of these is generally better for beginners, but both have good peer-reviewed information on a wide variety of philosophical topics. And in the bibliography section of the response paper guidelines, I have provided examples of how to properly cite from each of these sources. Now that we have covered the basic requirements, let's take a look at the grading rubric. Your response paper will be given a score out of 50 points. The basic requirements category will be worth 20 points, the explanation category will be worth 15, and the analysis category will also be worth 15 points. We will save discussion of how the explanation and analysis categories will be graded for later sections of this video. For the moment, however, have a look at the basic requirements category. Notice that we have covered all the items under this heading. You should treat the questions listed here like a checklist. Does your paper respond to the prompt? Do you meet the word requirement? Do you have the right section headings? Do you have a bibliography section with all sources cited properly? Do you have in-text citations for all paraphrases? And do you avoid using any direct quotations? I will treat your ability to do all these basic tasks as a minimum baseline for competency in this assignment. In this section of the video and the next one, we will discuss the two most substantial portions of the paper, the explanation section and the analysis section. We will begin by discussing the explanation section. The purpose of the explanation section is only to explain the argument that you are writing about. Later you will criticize the argument, but that comes next in your analysis section. In the explanation section, you are simply informing your reader about the author's argument. My aim here will be to explain how to identify the conclusion of the argument, identify its premises and logical structure, and explain the author's reasons for why those premises are true. First, we need to address what it means to successfully explain a philosophical argument. When grading your explanation section, I will evaluate whether you have provided a complete explanation of the argument. And I define a complete explanation as the following. Completely explaining a philosophical argument requires explaining everything an intelligent person who is unacquainted with philosophy, this class, or the argument you are writing about would need to fully understand that argument. So, it is important to have the right sort of audience in mind while you are writing your paper. Although I will be the one who ultimately reads your paper, you should not write as though that is the case. This is because I already know and understand the argument you are writing about. So if after reading your paper I can report that I understand the argument, that doesn't really tell us very much about the quality of your explanation. Instead, imagine that you are writing this paper for a person who is intelligent, someone interested in learning about philosophy, who has never taken a philosophy class or read this material. Now, what would be necessary to ensure that such a person could completely comprehend the argument? Well, you would have to define all important terms, clearly identify the conclusion of the argument, explain what is meant by that conclusion, and take the reader step by step through the logical progression of the author's reasoning. You should write as though your audience has never done the reading before, and after you've completed a first draft of your paper, read your paper again, imagining yourself as that person. If you can provide a complete explanation defined in this way, then you yourself would need to understand the argument in a thorough and detailed way. And after all, that is the very point of the assignment. In order to understand how to do this, we should begin with a broad view of what must be accomplished when explaining a philosophical argument. A complete explanation of a philosophical argument must answer three important questions. These questions and the relationship between them is displayed in the diagram on your screen. The first question is, what is the conclusion of the argument? What specific claim is the author arguing for? Although this might seem counterintuitive, before you concern yourself with the premises of the argument, you first need to know what the conclusion is. This is because knowing the conclusion of the argument sets the stage for everything else. Before you can understand the path the author takes, you first need to know where the author is going, what the author's destination is. Then, once you have identified the specific and precise conclusion the author argues for, you can begin to outline what premises the author uses to get to that conclusion. This brings us to question 2. What are the premises of the argument? What are the fundamental claims the author uses to establish that the conclusion is true? This point should of course be familiar from our previous lesson on logic. The premises are the reasons given for why the conclusion is true. So once we know what the conclusion of the argument is, we next need to ask, what are the premises? Once the premises and conclusion have been identified, there is one final step that is described in question 3. What reason does the author give us to think that the premises are true? In other words, what support is there for the premises? It is great to outline a set of premises from which a conclusion can be inferred, but why should we think that those premises are correct? What reason does the author offer for us to believe that they are true? This is a critical step because this is primarily where philosophical debate takes place. In many cases, philosophical debate concerns not whether the premises lead to the conclusion, but whether the premises themselves are correct or true. So it is important for your reader to understand the reasons the author has for asserting each premise of the argument. To see how you should structure your paper so that you make sure you address each of the 3 questions, let's return to the hypothetical paper I have been using as an example. First, we need to identify for the reader the conclusion of the argument. This is something you should address at the very beginning of your paper. I would recommend beginning your paper with a brief introduction to the argument and the topic that you are going to write about. For example, you might begin by stating that, in Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle explains the function argument. The purpose of this argument is to, and then you would proceed to state the conclusion that the author argues for. In addition, this initial introductory paragraph can also be used to touch on some of the major themes and questions that are at stake in thinking about this argument. What philosophical questions does this argument address? What are the major philosophical issues that this argument touches on? Again, here you should think about this from the point of view of an intelligent reader who is unfamiliar with the text. What is the information such an individual should know to fully comprehend the argument? Following this, you will then want to identify and explicitly state the premises of the argument. One way you can do this, and a way that I think is very effective, is by putting the argument into standard premise-conclusion form. As you see here, in doing this, I would list and label the premises P1, P2, and P3. Now, you do not necessarily need to put the argument in standard form as I have done here. However, you do need to state what you believe are the specific premises the author uses to arrive at the argument's conclusion. This is often the aspect of the paper that makes students the most nervous. Students often worry about whether they have identified exactly the right premises or whether they have the right number of them, etc. Now, I would encourage you to try not to get too caught up in worrying about whether the way you have outlined the argument is precisely the way that I would do it. There's always going to be more than one correct way of outlining an argument, and there's not some definitive number of premises your argument outline must have. Some arguments can be outlined with 2, others with 3, and others with more than that. So my first suggestion is to not let yourself become paralyzed because you are worried about getting your outline exactly right, or because you think there's one single correct way to outline the argument. Outlining philosophical arguments is difficult. It takes time and practice to learn how to understand philosophical writing and how to comprehend the logical inferences that an author is making. So perfection is not going to be required to get a good grade. The main thing I want to see is an honest attempt to separate out the distinct claims that you think the author uses to get to the conclusion. Even if the outline you produce is not quite right, the mere fact that you did the work to outline the argument in the first place demonstrates an effort to understand the logical structure of the argument and will also make your paper much more organized. So, I would encourage you to just dive in and give it your best effort, keeping in mind that I anticipate you improving your skills in this area over the course of the semester. Once you have stated the conclusion of the argument and identified the premises of the argument, you will have answered the first 2 questions. That leaves only the third question: what is the support for the premises? Or, what reasons does the author give for thinking that each premise is true? When addressing the support for the premises, you should proceed systematically. In this hypothetical paper, I am imagining that I have outlined the argument with 3 premises. So, I would first begin by explaining the support for premise 1. Then, I would explain the support for premise 2. And finally, I would explain the support for premise 3. When providing these explanations, you want to explain your points in as much detail as possible, in a way that shows a close reading of the text and which would allow someone who is not already familiar with the reading to understand the argument being made. You will notice that when introducing my explanation of premise 3, I state that this is the most controversial premise. This means that P3 is the premise most likely to cause disagreement. In any argument, it is often the case that some premises are less controversial. They are premises that many people would agree with, whereas other premises are more controversial, premises that it would be reasonable to expect many people to disagree with. It is a good idea to identify the most controversial premises of the argument because this can influence how you structure your paper going forward. It is unlikely that the premise you would criticize in your analysis section would be one of the uncontroversial premises. This is because such premises are not likely to be very problematic. Instead, the premise you would want to criticize would be one of the more controversial premises about which there would often be significant disagreement. And this choice of what premise you will later criticize has important ramifications for how you write the explanation section. If you have identified a premise as controversial and you have decided that you will criticize it in your analysis section, then you'll want to spend the most time explaining the support for that premise. And this should make intuitive sense. If a premise is controversial, then it is likely that the author will need to go to greater lengths to justify why that claim is true. And if that is the premise you will criticize, then you want to make sure that your criticism is fair and considers all the reasons the author gives in its favor. You need to avoid presenting the author's argument in a way that makes it seem weaker or more implausible than it really is. You want to make sure you are criticizing the strongest and most persuasive version of the argument. Doing this requires putting forth the effort to give a detailed explanation of the support for each of the premises. But in particular, you should take great pains to explain the most controversial premises of the argument. After all, it is likely that these are the premises or the premise that you plan to criticize in your analysis section. Now that we have covered the explanation section, let's take another look at the grading rubric. Your explanation section will be worth 15 points out of a total of 50 points for the paper overall. I also have a grading scale listed here. A grade of 15 out of 15 will require excellent work that is above the level of work I would likely expect from a beginning philosophy student, 12 points for good work, 8 for average work, and down from there. Grades will also be given in between those categories where appropriate. I also highlight here the primary things I am looking for when grading your explanation section. I want to see that you accurately and completely explain the argument by introducing the topic, making the logical structure of the argument clear, identifying the premises and conclusion of the argument, and explaining in a detailed fashion the support for each premise with particular attention to those premises that are most controversial. In other words, what I'm looking for are all of the main points that I've covered in this section of the video. Finally, it is time to discuss the analysis section of your paper. Recall that in the vast majority of cases, in your analysis section you will be required to criticize the argument that you have just outlined in the explanation section. If in some particular case the analysis section of your paper requires you to do something different, then the essay prompt itself will indicate that to you. What I have highlighted here is the portion of the essay prompt, the one we've been using as an example so far, which tells you what you need to do in the analysis section. Here we can see that the prompt tells you need to criticize Aristotle's argument. Again, that means in your analysis section, you need to make a case for why Aristotle's argument is faulty or incorrect. But you are probably wondering, what exactly is the process for criticizing a philosophical argument? If the argument is structured correctly, such that the premises support the conclusion, then the soundness of the argument will hinge upon whether its premises are true. This means that the argument will be unsound if just one premise of the argument is false. So, when criticizing a philosophical argument, the basic procedure is to select one premise of the argument and explain why that premise is false. In my example paper, I have decided to criticize premise 3, and notice that I tell this to the reader in the very first sentence of the analysis section. Here I will argue that the function argument is unsound because premise 3 is false. This sentence specifically identifies which premise of the argument I will criticize and makes that clear to the reader. What you should recognize at this point is that I do not just want you to critique the argument in an abstract or general way. I want you to select some particular premise of the argument, focus in on the claim made by that premise, and provide detailed reasoning for why it is incorrect. This means that if you have a sentence like this one in your paper, a sentence which explicitly identifies the part of the argument that you will criticize, then you are on the right track. The rest of your analysis section would then be taken up with explaining your reasoning for why that premise is incorrect with as much depth, detail, and critical thinking as possible. For this reason, there is nothing more that I will need to add to this response paper outline. If you would like to use this document for your reference when writing your own paper, then I've included a link to it in the video description below. Let's conclude by looking at the grading rubric one final time. Once again, your analysis section will receive a score out of 15, where 15 is excellent, 12 is good, 8 is average, and etc. Furthermore, there are 3 main questions I will consider when grading the analysis section of your paper. First, do you clearly identify which premise of the argument you will criticize? Do you state at the outset of your analysis section that you will criticize some particular premise of the argument? Second, the criticism you make should demonstrate that you correctly understand your opponent's argument. It can be very easy to criticize an author for claims that he or she does not make. This is sometimes known as the straw man fallacy, where someone constructs their opponent's argument in a weak fashion and then criticizes that weak but inaccurate version of the argument. Obviously, this is something that you need to avoid, and to some extent, you can make sure that you do this by doing a good job explaining that author's argument in the explanation section. Finally, I will also evaluate the accuracy, depth, and critical thinking that is displayed in your criticism. And it is this criteria which really separates the excellent from the good papers and the good papers from the average papers. I want to see that you have thought seriously about the argument you are criticizing, have thought about the broader implications of the points you make, and that you explain all of this in a clear and detailed fashion. Now, learning how to do this is not easy, but my hope is that with time, practice, and by paying close attention to how philosophical argumentation works as you make your way through the lectures, that your ability to do this will improve over the course of the semester.